Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at Corporia by Mark Plemmons. I'm reviewing a PDF version which comes in at about 211 pages, and it's a curious mix of a dystopian near future mixed in with medieval chivalry and ideas about reincarnation. I was lucky enough to be sent a review copy, so thank you very much for that, and let's get straight on to the actual contents without any further ado. We start off with a section called Preface to the Digital Edition, and this is one of the first PDFs I've actually seen to provide a specific introduction to their digital edition, offering advice on how to best view the electronic version and even a form fillable character sheet. This is a great innovation and something I hope is taken up by other publishers in the future, actually incorporating a form fillable PDF into their main book rather than as a separate bolt-on that you have to download afterwards. We then move on to the main introduction, which gives a brief intro to the setting by the author that sums up the core concepts of the book, with the players portraying new knights of the Round Table living in a regimented metropolis controlled by faceless mega corporations. It's certainly an intriguing concept for a game, and as a fan of mashup concepts, I'm interested to see how it comes off. So let's get straight to it as we dive into the content. And there's a fairly comprehensive contents page, each section being hyperlinked in the PDF, which again is a great thing since it makes it very easy to navigate around the electronic file. And it's here we first get a glimpse of the art direction for the rest of the book, a mix of photographic and CGI artwork that, whilst perhaps not suitable for every type of book, works well for the concepts and the mix of ideas espoused in Corporia. The next section is called The Story So Far, and it gives us a bit of fiction that very briskly sums up the main points of the game. Ancient monsters and foes from a more magical past have returned to a drab and oppressive corporate world. In order to combat them, the heroes of legend have also been reborn. Although the story was fairly brief and it's not one of the most exciting pieces that I've read, it did lay out in no uncertain terms what the central focus of the game is, and it did so without unnecessary padding or feeling that it was stretched out at all. We then move on to a section that's titled The Basics, and as well as containing the obligatory What is Roleplay section, the Basics chapter starts with going into more detail about the game's core concept. Players take on the role of members of the Night's Watch, spelt with a K, a sort of supernaturally empowered security force led by the reincarnated Knights of the Round Table to combat the rising supernatural threats. Members of the Night's Watch are hand-picked from those humans who have the ability to manipulate an other-dimensional energy force known as the Flux. Paradoxically, the Flux is also the same thing that mutates people into cryptid horrors and causes strange manifestations of evil. This section is fairly basic, but I suppose that's quite appropriate given the title of it. Some of the artwork is very graphically striking, and the book is presented in a clear and pleasingly uncluttered format. Although there were some strange odd passages highlighted in yellow on my PDF, I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, but it didn't spoil my enjoyment of reading the book any. Characters are defined at first by their core competency, effectively a power level for characters that determines how many points a player has to split between the core values, statistics, of strength, deftness, mettle, knowledge, wits and magic, giving each a rating from 1 to 6. There's mention here of the concept called Flux Dice within the game, which is basically a term for rolling 2d6 and keeping the highest roll. This represents the PCs being more in tune with the dimensional magics flowing through the city, and it's similar to the advantage mechanic that I've most recently seen in D&D 5th Ed. Players also gain Flux Points during play by playing out their traits. These points can be used to alter events during play. So the Flux in terms of mechanics seems to represent both a dice roll and a point buy system. I'm interested to see these two working together, and I think that could allow the players a great deal of input into the game, as well as gaining some systemic bonus for actually role-playing their traits. And I'm all for players getting a bit of a Billy bonus for playing their characters and really investing in the roleplay, so that's good to see. The game system is a fairly standard one. You roll a dice and you add modifiers. If you equal or exceed a difficulty number or an opponent's roll if it's opposed, then you have succeeded. There's nothing particularly original about it, but it works fine for the game and there's nothing wrong with it as a system. Combat works by the normal method of making initiative rolls and then proceeding in order around the table, with each person making a move and attack per round. Damage does work in a slightly more unusual fashion. If a character is injured, then they only take 1 point of damage, although there are optional rules where for every raise, 5 points greater than the numbers needed for success, you add an additional level of damage. This is interesting because it seems to suggest that players can stay on their feet for an awfully long time. But given that one of the influences cited for the book is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and it has that same sort of high action, high octane feel to it, that seems only appropriate. The next segment of the book is called Human Resources, and the second section begins with discussing character concepts, and I was pleased to see that the game didn't just include players as reincarnated knights. Cool though that is, it's always nice to have a bit of variety in a game. The description of Night's Watch is full of tongue-in-cheek references to Arthurian legend, such as the Master Eye Registrar and Logistical Intelligence Network, Merlin, and various reincarnated versions of figures from legend. Merlin monitors for spikes in flux activity, whilst Vivian Morrow, Lady Nimue reincarnated, receives prophetic visions. Once a disturbance is detected, the player characters are dispatched to deal with it. The game uses archetypes such as the Badge, Headhunter and Journo, to name but 3 of them, to help people define their characters. These function as guidelines to creating particular types of character, but they're not quite as restrictive as classes or other character splats in some other games. The artwork for the archetypes is generally photographic with some electronic additions. That's no bad thing. It reminded me very much of an updated version of the art in the old Mind's Eye Theatre White Wolf live action books, and very much suits the style of the game. Players pick 4 personality traits, 3 public and 1 private, to define their character, and it is by playing these traits that the player gains Flux Points. An interesting wrinkle is that the game provides an optional system to help advise players on the sorts of traits they might like to choose. The book lists star signs such as Aries, Taurus, Gemini, etc., and gives a series of appropriate traits related to that star sign. The player can either pick a sign and associated traits, or roll randomly should they so wish. I think this is an interesting extra bit of flavour, and it gives the reader some examples of what the author considers to be a suitable group of personality traits. A more detailed explanation for the core competency, core values and skill sets follows, and it was at this point I started to notice the use of business jargon and terminology used in place of the more common names for various stats and ideas throughout the game. This does make the book feel more business-like, which has both good and bad points. Good since it really ties into the whole idea that the world is ruled by these monolithic megacorporations, and bad because business terms aren't exactly known for their excitement-boosting properties, but it works within the context of the game. The skill list is serviceable, but nothing particularly remarkable. Flux points are explained in a little more detail and how they can be used. They're earned by playing out your traits or for particularly epic moments of roleplay, and they are spent to ignore wounds or gain a temporary bonus to dice rolls. Characters also earn what are called building points whenever traits come up in play, and flux points are spent or earned. Building points are spent like XP in more traditional games. As befitting a game where PCs have supernatural abilities, players also gain asset points at character creation to spend on various different flavours of special abilities, along with weapons, equipment and rep points, a sort of scale of social standing. This is interesting because it incorporates the idea of databases and social media as an indicator of standing. I'm not sure how much of a focus I'd personally want to make it in a game. or indeed whether it requires a separate subsystem, but it would be very easy to ignore or include as much or as little of that as you wanted to. The next part of the book is called Assets, and it's essentially a merits and flaws chapter that also contains various supernatural powers. It covers a wide gamut of abilities, from the more mundane but still useful abilities like funding or influential, to the powers of supernatural bloodlines or limited psionic powers granted by the Flux's interaction with brain chemistry, effectively spell or magic-like abilities. The list of spells and how they are applied is presented in a curious manner as a business pamphlet titled the Thornberry Cage Energy Initiative, which views magic through a pseudo-scientific lens as extra-dimensional energies that can be manipulated by the skilled practitioners. Now, this may not be to everyone's cup of tea or everyone's taste, but it was certainly a novel and slightly different way of presenting it. The next chapter is an equipment chapter called Expenses, and it's in itself it's fairly unremarkable. Given that such chapters can be quite dry, however, the author has spiced it up with a number of faux adverts and some subtle setting material threaded throughout the section, which I think was a very wise choice, given how dry such equipment chapters can be. I particularly liked the section on wands. It's rare to see even a fantasy game that goes into so much detail on the construction and materials used in wands, so I really wasn't expecting it in a setting that has some very strong dystopian / cyberpunk leaning, but it was a very pleasant surprise. Section 5 provides a guide to the default setting of the game, titled The City, a nebulous location that could be placed almost anywhere by the aspiring GM, and is ruled over by an oppressive regime of corporations that have risen to power over the bodies of the poor and oppressed. Money and acquisition of it would appear to be the major occupation in the setting. Even religion, the so-called mega-churches of the setting, has been co-opted by the corporations and turned into yet another outlet for the almighty corporate dollar. Only the production of nanotechnology and other such advancements has prevented the physicality of the city from devolving as much as its spirituality and the souls of its denizens. Into this drab, money-grubbing limbo comes the Flux, a strange energy from another dimension that results in disturbances and mutations on rare occasions. Its most common effect is the scrambling of electronic devices. Perhaps as a reaction to this, the retro movement, a group that places value on old-fashioned solid-state storage devices and such archaic technology, has arisen, giving you, the GM, a great excuse to use all manner of anachronistic technology in the setting. We then move on to the City and Vicinity Visitor's Guide, and this section is laid out like a tourist brochure, which I quite like because tourist brochures, eyewitness guides, etc. have been a staple source of information for me when running games set in grim versions of the real world, or when I'm creating cities where I'm trying to capture that real world feel to them. The faux introduction page lets you know straight away that this is not an entirely unbiased view of the city, presented as it is by Jason M. Grant, CEO of Globex, and it portrays the city as a shining, exquisite utopia, quite at odds with some of the other setting material. And it's always great to see this sort of icy narration and bias, because as well as telling you bits and pieces about the actual setting, it also tells you a lot about the person who's trying to sell you on their vision of the setting. In this case, Globex. The guide covers everything that you would expect to see in a city supplement, although given that it's only a small part of the book, it is by necessity condensed somewhat. And it covers everything from travel routes down to the open wireless network available throughout the city. A colourful map of the city districts gives an overview of the city without too strictly defining every street and alleyway, which is a great thing because it allows the GM of a particular game to stamp their own mark on the city. Write-ups of the various districts and brief descriptions of the prominent megacorporations that rule the city follow on from this, some of which are clearly based on actual modern businesses. My favourite is Peppy Cola, a huge beverage megacorporation with a sinisterly cheerful, animate beverage as their mascot. Section 6 is the GMing chapter, which begins by presenting the Flux as the ultimate rationale for any weirdness that you want to introduce in your game, whether it be orcs, vampires, or even an outbreak of zombie plague. This is no doubt very handy for the GM, but I'm always a little wary of games with just a single rationale. They can become a little bit cartoony, and I can imagine that after a while a GM running Corporia might have to expand their explanations beyond "the Flux did it." Of particular interest is the mentions of a coming apocalypse. Both Nimue and Merlin have predicted a forthcoming invasion by the extra-dimensional forces of chaos. Although there isn't a great deal of information on it, perhaps it'll be covered in future supplements, I don't know, there are some very interesting hints and tips about the extra-dimensional forces that are seeking to breach the barrier between their world and our own. The game moves on to offer a suggested structure for writing adventures that it calls Grail, and this stands for Goal, which is the aim of the mission; Recon, where the Night Watch first attempt to scope out the scene; Assault, option 1, which is one method of solving a problem, normally involving violence; Infiltration, option 2, which is normally a way of solving the problem without obvious violence; and finally Liquidation, reaching the goal and wrapping up the adventure. And I think this is a great thing, especially for newer GMs, since it gives them a solid structure to work on when creating their own adventures. The GM advice offered in the book is all very good and will be very handy, especially, as I say, to newer GMs, but there's certainly something in there to interest the more experienced GMs amongst us. There are also some design tips for creating NPCs and cryptids, in addition to some suggestions for using megacorps in the game. There is a series of random tables for designing areas of the city, a mini adventure seed, and then this is followed up by the inevitable bestiary section, which is split into the forces of order, chaos and cryptids. Personally, I found the cryptids section of most interest, containing such lovelies as Geists, which are the last neural impulses of dying people given a formless life by the surrounding flux energy; Horde, a nanovirus that causes hosts to become raging bloodthirsty maniacs with heightened senses; and Succubus, females affected by the flux who gain the ability to secrete pheromones that are incredibly seductive to the opposite sex. And we wrap up this section with a short piece on relics, items affected by the flux, and these seem fairly similar to magic items in some other games. The book finishes with a comprehensive index that does not appear to be hyperlinked in the PDF version I'm looking at, which is odd considering the big deal the book made about the advantages of an electronic version at the start. However, given the comprehensiveness of the contents page and the hyperlinks there, it's not a major issue, to be honest. What it does do, though, is it colour codes pages containing director or GM only info, and this is a neat thing that I've not seen in games before. There's an index of named city locations, which will be very handy for the aspiring Corporia GM, and a very neat 9-stage PC creation guide, which handily fits onto a single side of A4, and I can see that being printed out and handed around to players. Very useful indeed. The author then gives a nod to his sources of inspiration, including books, graphic novels, films, podcasts, RPGs, television shows and video games, and it's always a nice thing to see, since it lets you know what mindset the author was in when they were creating the book and what influenced them. It also may give you some ideas for some things to go out and look at that will influence your own games. And the appendices round off with a nice clear character sheet that is form fillable in the copy built directly into the book. Another great idea that I've not seen in many other RPGs. So, what's my verdict on Corporia? Well, to be honest, I have mixed feelings about the book, all in all. There are a great number of things I enjoy in the setting, and some I'm maybe not so keen on. I like the city. It has everything a dystopian future setting should have. The megacorps, an excuse for magical creatures, everything you want. In fact, it reminds me very much of Shadowrun, without such a vastly clunky set of rules holding it back. I also like the idea of the reincarnated Knights of the Round Table thrown into this modernised setting. However, the focus of the game did come off as a little bit narrow in the book. Even the game itself describes it as a diamond model of plot, where it has a narrow beginning a wide range of plots in the middle before again narrowing and tapering off to the inevitable apocalypse at the end. I'm not sure how entirely comfortable I am with that quite narrow mode of plot, but I suppose a GM could always throw that out the window and do whatever they wanted with the game anyway. The highlight of the book for me comes in two parts. The setting of the city is great, and it contains ready-made material that could be dropped into almost any dystopian or cyberpunk or futuristic game. In fact, I could see it very easily being dropped into a Judge Dredd game. The other part I really like is the Flux, and the way the author has obviously put some thought into how they can tweak their monsters to make them just a little bit different from the majority of generic cookie-cutter creatures in some other RPGs. And this is a very satisfying thing to see, since there are loads of monster bestiaries out there, and many of them tread exactly the same ground. It's nice to see someone putting a little bit of thought into just giving a bit of an odd spin or twist on familiar creatures. If you're planning to run a dystopian future or cyberpunk game and you want a setting, or maybe you're looking for a Monster of the Week style game, then Corporia could be for you. It has a very solid rule system and an interesting background, although a lot of it will be familiar to long-time role players. At £6.12 GBP off DriveThruRPG for the PDF, and for a very neatly laid out and professional looking PDF, you really cannot go far wrong with this system. So I would highly recommend it. I hope if you've enjoyed this video, you'll consider clicking on like and subscribe. We put out new videos every week. You can subscribe by clicking on the red dice up there. If you have any comments, as always, put them in the box below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this review, or if you've played Corporia or you have any suggestions, let me know. Until I see you in my next video, take care, thank you very much for watching and for listening.